not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
The Greek of that sentence is helpfully ambiguous. It could be respectably rendered, as indeed it is in the King James Version, as 77, 70 times 7. The sharpest amongst you will already, no doubt, have calculated the resulting difference in the number of times Jesus calls upon Peter to forgive his brother or sister, depending on those different translations. 413, wake up at the back. But of course, to worry about this is to miss the point, rather. To miss, just as St. Peter misses in this gospel excerpt, something about the nature of forgiveness as Jesus wants us to frame it. Resonating with that foundational story of sin in the 4th chapter of Genesis, if Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. These rhetorical words are meant to promote inexhaustible forgiveness from and between Jesus' followers. Peter is called upon to forgive dramatically more than he imagined, or perhaps at this stage wanted to imagine. But let's for a moment bear with him in his question, how oft shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? It's not necessarily a bad or surprising one, is it? Not a bad question from the figure upon whom the church was to be built. Not a bad question for the one to whom the charge was given a few chapters ago. Whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. The moral and pastoral responsibility that is to be Peter's charge demands such a question be taken seriously. It's a question that all of us will likely have to ask ourselves from time to time in all sorts of different ways and contexts. The question is especially pertinent given the gospel passage it follows, the one we heard last week, with its practical prescription of a sort of 3 strikes and you're out policy. Failing that, let the offender, writes St. Matthew, be unto thee as an heathen man and a publican. Hard words that offend our optimistic hopes and our liberal sympathies, just as this week's perhaps offend against our sense of what's truly practical or realistic. A part of our work might be to discern and distinguish carefully between an authentic voice of Jesus Christ and the later concerns of the community for which St. Matthew was writing. We have always to be mindful of that distinction in our reception of the Gospels. But that shouldn't come at the cost of tension, ambiguity, nuance, incidences of which perhaps tell us as much about the truth of what it is to live the Christian life as some sort of boiled down, unambiguous set of rulings. The shape of St. Matthew's Gospel is one of undulation rather than the great arc we might attribute to St. John's. It's the ups and downs of Sussex's 7 sisters rather than the stately ascent of Skiddaw. For time and again, Matthew flanks a certain rigidity with a category-shattering, radical vision of forgiveness. The two go together. After last week's legal practicality, today's 70 times 7 not only playfully demands that we generously extend the parameters of our mercy to a 4th or 5th or 7th occasion, but asks us more fundamentally to look at the whole matter anew. Note too how Jesus' story does not quite directly answer Peter's question head on. For this reason the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king, he says. 10,000 talents, like the 77 times, stands for an immense, surprising sum. I'm never quite sure about the worth of translating that into today's terms, but some commentators suggest something like £1 billion with all its rhetorical sense. The story's striking images are the king's abundant generosity and the meanness of his servant in response. We are called to look upon all that the Lord has given us in this world, to all the Lord promises us in the next, to all he offers us through his church's sacraments right now, and to let that place of gratitude be the place from which we dare to look at the shortcomings of others. From a question of worldly legality, today our attention is turned away to our hearts, to the spirit in which we go about our lives. It doesn't rescind what has been said or do away with the practical need for consequences, rules, and redress. But Matthew reminds us how those two attitudes, rigidity and radicalism, if you like, must always be held together, at least this side of heaven. This morning's liturgy of the Word gave us examples in this vein. For all the worldly prestige and power given to Joseph in Egypt, his sympathy with his brothers and his knowledge of the Lord informs his wise response to his authority. Am I in the place of God? And St. Paul seems to acknowledge that as Christians we will inevitably differ and look to different linchpins onto which to make sense of and hold on to our faith, to those of others whose faith is equally sincere. For all his rigidity and for all the unshakable importance of orthodoxy and individual and corporate integrity, St. Paul gives room for honourable disagreement and indeed demands mutual respect. He even seems to call upon us to be nice to vegetarians. For all its resulting messiness and human frustration, such an attitude is important too in reminding each of us for the need to grow in humility if we are to more truly follow the Lord. That none of us are in the place of God, that none of us have all the answers. To paraphrase St. Peter's successor, Pope Francis, who am I, who are we to judge? A final note. In our angst about who we can or ought to tolerate or live with, who we can forgive and how many times, let us not forget to look with compassion upon those people who at times it is hardest to forgive. That most difficult bunch of intransigents that we call ourselves. If we're to be of any use to others, take to heart the loving forgiveness we have received and which is yet offered to us at the cross, in the Mass, through the sacrament of reconciliation, in each other. Loving forgiveness that is much less a reluctant, surly ticking off than it is a call into abundance of life. Not 7 times, but 70 times 7, or at least thereabouts.